I'm going to start in the book of Luke chapter 9 to get us kicked off today. And while you're turning your Bibles over there, just want to mention how much I appreciate you making me preach on my vacation. Now, it was a joyful event to meet with the brethren here on Wednesday evening and be invited back to bring forth the good word. It's always a joy to study and worship the God of heaven with his people, wherever they may be. And I figured you probably have already observed that I'm in my Sunday best for camping, along with my Birkenstock sandals. But I did bathe this morning in the river. But let's go ahead and see what the God of heaven will bring forth to us today, using me as his vessel. The book of Luke chapter 9, let's read verse 51 together. Luke writes, "As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem." Just based off of this verse alone, we have a clue as to the timing that this was written, or that it is writing about. The King James Version, which is the version that I usually use, says that Jesus steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. Something happened at this moment. I don't know what it was. Jesus had some inclination. The Father of heaven must have put something within his heart and his mind to where his attention had shifted, and he then realized it is time. The book of Luke, from this moment forth, and if you notice, it's 24 odd chapters in the book of Luke. So from chapters 9 to the chapter 24, that is all information regarding Jesus' final journey from the northern country down into Jerusalem to where he would be crucified. So the timing here gives us an idea, gives us a little bit of setting. Before this moment took place for Jesus to be steadfastly setting his face to go toward Jerusalem, which was his final mission upon the earth, two significant events take place. And you notice within the context preceding the verse that we had just read, starting at about verse 28 of this chapter, you have the transfiguration of Jesus. What a sight that must have been. And right before that, Jesus had a conversation with his disciples when he asked them, "Whom do men say that I am?" And of course, that brought forth, that prompted Peter to give the good confession. I like to more so call it the good declaration. And so what I want to do is first take notice of a couple of things, and I'm going to do it in a broad sense first off here, because we're going to focus in on a few things within the good confession and how that happens and some things we can learn from that. But first, just take notice, we're going to be in Matthew 16, so you can turn your Bibles on over there. And before we actually read the text in Matthew, which is going to be taking place around the same period of time, just a different author, of course, I want to take notice of two of the things that show the theme around what's happening in Jesus' life at this time. In the Transfiguration, when Peter, James, and John were there and his face starts to shine and even his clothing changes and becomes bright, Moses and Elijah appear and start having a conversation with Jesus. And when Peter opens his eyes and realizes what happened, he says to Jesus, "It's good for us to be here." And then he makes this suggestion. Let's build 3 tabernacles here. And you know what a tabernacle is, right? Tabernacle was a tent of worship. That was a place that was to be an extremely holy place. And behind the veil was the place where the Ark of the Covenant was to be set. And that was considered the Holy of Holies. And legend has it that when the high priest, who was the only person who could go behind that curtain, when he was to go behind that curtain to do the sacrifices on the, what was that day? Yom Kippur. What's the English word for that? I forgot. Something. Let's make it more official. Yom Kippur. Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement. There we go. When the high priest was to go behind the curtain on the Day of Atonement, legend has it that they actually tied a rope around his waist, because if he didn't do things right, he would die on the spot. And, who's going to go get him? I ain't going to go get him. So they would be able to drag him out. That was how holy the tabernacle was supposed to be. Now, Peter, we all know him. He's kind of like some of us here, right? We speak before we think. And he says, let's build 3 tabernacles, one for you, and let's make one for Moses and Elijah. And then a voice from heaven says, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him." Moses was just a man. Elijah was just a man. Jesus is the God of heaven. And this is just one of 2 times that I know of off the top of my head that the God of heaven, the Father in heaven, speaketh from above in the New Testament. It's all over the Old Testament, right? But there's only 2 times when the Father in heaven speaks. It's at the baptism of Jesus and at the transfiguration of Jesus. Because he sent his Son to speak on his behalf, right? And he declares him, and he discerns a massive difference between him and anybody else, all men. And then we take a look at the good confession, and let's go ahead and read that one together. Matthew chapter 16, we'll begin in verse 13. And along the way, I'm going to give you a few of the kind of historical, more geographical points, just to make it come alive, you know what I mean? So Matthew 16, verse 13, it says, "When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi," stop right there. I just want to give you an idea of where that is. A lot of us have kind of an idea of the map of the Holy Land in our mind. And, it kind of goes from north to south. Galilee is in the northern territory. Jerusalem is in the southern part of the Holy Land. But kind of outside of Jewish jurisdiction goes up into a place called Caesarea Philippi, and there was a mountain up there called Mount Hermon. So what's happening now during the time of the life of Jesus is he didn't really get an amazing reception from the very beginning, especially from the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? But the heat is starting to turn up. they're starting to realize more and more and more, this Jesus character, this clown who's trying to take away our glory, he's not going away for some reason. There have been other movements in history. There have been other people who claim to be prophets, and they got shut down pretty quick. But there's something about this Jesus. Even John the Baptist got his head taken from him by the king. But Jesus ain't going nowhere. And his glory seems to be getting more and more and more. His words are so glorious. He's so beautiful and he has so much power. But we don't like him because it's all about me. It's all about our glory. So as the heat is getting turned up and the Pharisees are thinking to themselves, what are we going to do about this guy? They're starting to plot more and more and more how we're going to take him out. Well, what happens is Jesus kind of gets pushed up north. Jesus wasn't going around looking for trouble. Jesus was still flesh, don't forget that. He got tired. He had to take naps. You remember what he did. You guys know what to do, right, when you go through trouble? You know, what in WWJD, what would Jesus do? If you're in the middle of a storm, take a nap. I don't know how Jesus is in life-threatening weather, and he's like, you know what? Throw in the towel a minute here and go take a nap, gentlemen. But Jesus wasn't looking for trouble, right? And he still was flesh, and he would tell people, don't tell people who I am. And when he had the people surrounding him, he needed his time with the Father. He had to go to the mountain to pray. He had to spend time alone. And so he would go up, and he got pushed up into the northern country on the base of Mount Hermon. And that's where this takes place. By the way, the transfiguration probably happened on Mount Hermon, so Jesus was also a hiker. So, in the northern country, verse 13, I'm just going to reread that beginning there again to get the flow going. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. What about you? He asked. Who do you say that I am? Simon Peter answered, saying, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man. You notice that? Notice that theme. Remember the theme in Matthew 17 or in Luke that we had just took note of the transfiguration? Two men came to life who had been dead, and they spoke with Jesus there. And Peter wants to honor these two men, and the Father from heaven says, no, he doesn't say no, but that's just kind of, he says, this is my son. It's not about them, it's about him. It's about God, it's about Jesus, God in the flesh. And here we have the same theme being brought forth, which says, this was not revealed to you by man. Earlier he asked the question, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, is? Jesus is bringing forth into our minds a discernment, a difference. Because people could say all kinds of stuff about Jesus. And they were mistaken. People thought he was Elijah. People thought he's John the Baptist. People thought, and those are good people. If I could be compared to John the Baptist, I'd be like, hey, I feel kind of good about that right now. If I could be compared to Elijah, I'd be like, well, me? Oh, well, thank you. You know, like that would be nice if people compared me to men like that. But even those men had nothing on Jesus. And it didn't matter what men said about Jesus. What mattered was what the Father in heaven said about Jesus. And Jesus tells Peter there, you didn't get this from men. But by my Father in heaven. That's power. That is power. The God in heaven, the same God that overthrew the Pharaoh who thought he was a God among men. The same God that made the mountains that surround you here in Salmon, Idaho, and can make them crumble at the word of his mouth. Can pick them up and move them into the Pacific Ocean if he so desires. The God of heaven who could take a mountain and then put his finger down upon it and turn it into a lake, which is now called Crater Lake. That's the God of heaven who speaks about Jesus. And who speaks from heaven unto this day through these words that we get to share and feast upon here today. But now I want you to notice with me verse 18. And I tell you, notice how Jesus says, now it's my turn to talk. The Father in heaven speaketh. Now I say, I tell you that you are Peter. And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now I wanted to start this off by truly establishing a sense and an awareness of the power of God, but mainly, of course, the power of God and his voice as it pertains to the Son of God. Oh, we could talk about the power of God in creation. We could talk about the power of God and how he can overthrow kingdoms, how he can build the kingdoms, how he can decrease the kingdoms, how he can do anything he wants to do in a physical form, how he even made the stars which shine above us. But truly the power that really counts to us is the power of salvation that God has made for us. For some odd, crazy reason, God looks upon mankind and sees mankind as a special part of his creation. He sees you as more than all the gloriousness of everything else he has made. I don't know what it is about us that he sees. David himself from the 8th Psalm said, when I behold the stars and when I look at the moon and the things that the God has made, what is man that you are mindful of him? What is it about us that you have visited us and you have cared about us? Why would he send himself? Why would God himself come down from heaven, dislodge himself from his mighty throne? Why would he give up the glorious place that he tells us about, where the angels praise and glorify him, to come down here to be butchered by men? What is it about us that he would be willing to do that for us? Because we know when we look in the mirror and when we see how amazing he is, and when we actually take an actual reflection on what we have done and who we are, we realize that we are but dust before him, lower than it even. But he came here to make a people, to make we dust more than dust. He came here to show us that there is hope. But you can't find that hope when you look at the government. You can't find that hope when you look at Google, when you look at social media. You can't find that hope when you look anywhere else, but unless you look to Jesus. And he says with his own breath, upon this rock I will build my church. Now think about it now. You know what he's building? Kind of 2 points I want to take away and extract from this right now here today with you this morning. And that is that he is still building. I know that because aren't we here today? You know what the church is, right? It ain't the studs in the walls. It ain't the nice paint. It looks nice, man. I tell you, it's a nice place you got here. It ain't the roof. It ain't the parking lot. It's saved souls who work together. And I tell you now today, by the power of the Son who spoke these words, that Jesus is building you. You are still yet being built. You have work to do, and when you work in his name, your work in the Lord is never in vain. And you can know that as long as you are feasting off of the word, that you are being transformed by the renewing of your mind. And his word never returns void. And you bring forth that word to those people around you. And you make sure you speak that word and you keep building, because you plant that seed, you bring that word to others, you bring it to the community, you use that, I heard the house to house, I heard that that's going on right now. You keep spreading that word and it will build. That seed gets planted and make sure it keeps on getting watered. Paul planted seeds, Apollos watered, and as a result of that, the church of Corinth was able to grow. He's still building. For me to be able to take a vacation in Salmon and to be able to wake up from the mountains and come to a place and still worship with God's people is a blessing, because God has built this church. And then the second point that I want to take away from that is, and this one's sweet, and this one is one of the ones I want you to really think about. And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. You know why it's so important for us to always go back to the word every single time, every single day? If you ain't going to the word every day, boy, you got something going on with you. Ain't no dust to be collecting up on your word, on your Bible, on your sword. And the reason why this is so important is because it is the words from the Father, which we started off emphasizing. When it came to men and the words of men, that will fade. Things like Follow your heart. That's a saying of man that will fade. The word says, the heart is deceitful above all things, who can know it? And Proverbs tells us that a fool trusts in his own heart. Those words will fade. But the words of God shall stand forever, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. We broached it briefly in the Bible class this morning. One of the comments that was made. It made me think about how there are popular sayings out there like, "You are enough." Those words will fade. We are not enough. We need the Son of God. We need His Word. We need to feed upon it. Like children have to feed upon the sincere milk of the Word and grow thereby, that we can move on to the meat of the Word. The words of the Father will never fade. The disciples, even those that had direct contact and training from Jesus, they were afraid. And they still suffered from unbelief. Not long hereafter, this text that we are now in, a man approached Jesus, this is in Matthew 17, and asked Jesus, "Can you heal my son, because he has been afflicted by an unclean spirit?" And I asked your disciples, and they couldn't do it. And so when Jesus heard this, he responded by saying, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you and put up with this? Bring me the boy." And they brought him the boy. And he rebuked the unclean spirit, and the spirit was removed. And his disciples asked, "Jesus, why couldn't we do it?" And he said, "It's because of your unbelief. If you have faith of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, pick up and move into the sea, and it will happen." And then he says, "But this kind of thing happens by prayer and fasting." So to acknowledge that problem that the disciples had, even those who were able to do the good confession like Peter, they still struggled with it. And the reason why is because they would allow their own thoughts, their own inhibitions, their own fears, on what people might think, what might happen. I mean, all kinds of things enter into our consciousness whenever we get placed in the position of doing the work of the Father. But the key was their faith in God's power and not their own. I work hard at trying to give the best delivery I can possibly give when I stand before God's people and preach. And I know that whenever you have opportunity to have a conversation about Jesus with anybody in the community, that you're going to have a little bit of a self-consciousness. And when you walk away from that conversation, especially when people may argue and say things that they ought not to say about the Son of God, and you start to worry about it. And as you walk away from the conversation, how often you say, oh man, I should have said this, or I could have said that. But you need to understand and realize that the power is not within you, but in the power of the Father. When Peter gave the good confession, it was because the Father in heaven revealed it, and not because he had some majestic way of bringing it forth. No one understand that you are a citizen of a kingdom that is in heaven, and there is no way that anything, the gates of hell included, can do anything to stop it. So never let anything keep you from doing what you know you ought to do and bring forth that word. The Lord needs laborers in his vineyard, so keep on marching forward. And if you have not responded to the gospel yourself, if you have not given your life to the Father and become a part of this kingdom that cannot be destroyed, then you will be destroyed. So you must make sure that you get to a place, you get to a position of acknowledging the Father and He and only Him and His word, so that you will never be destroyed, so that as we stand and sing and march together like soldiers, you can be baptized and become a soldier and march with us while we stand and sing.